Welcome to this story, one of the most unsettling cases ever noted in New Mexico. Before we dive in, share in the comments where you're tuning in from and the exact time you started listening. It's always interesting to see the different places and hours of the day or night where these stories reach. The year was 1876. New Mexico was still a territory, sparsely charted by government surveyors, crisscrossed by dusty stagecoach lines, and dotted with scattered settlements where law often trailed far behind necessity. The Copper Queen Saloon, a wooden structure set near a narrow road, was one of the more enduring establishments in that corner of the frontier. Its painted sign, stiff against the desert wind, announced respite for weary miners, ranchers, and the occasional marshal passing through. Within its doors worked two sisters whose names seldom appear in formal ledgers, but are whispered in county notes and journal fragments, Margaret and Eliza Rowan. Both were said to be reserved yet unwavering presences, keeping the saloon orderly and profitable. In a frontier culture that often left women marginal, their command of the barroom drew curiosity, sometimes suspicion. They watched the room like hawks, recalled an 1883 affidavit attributed to a miner named Charles Hinton, and a man felt himself measured the moment he set foot inside. Records from Bisbee, Arizona, just across the border, describe a surge in mining camps during that same decade, with saloons springing up overnight to feed and shelter laborers. This regional backdrop helps explain how such establishments in New Mexico could thrive, and why the Rowan sisters' enterprise escaped deeper scrutiny for as long as it did. The Rowan property had been built hastily, its timbers mismatched, the floorboards uneven, yet it offered the luxuries of spirits, a few imported bottles of whiskey, and music from a crack, and upright piano. Behind the bar, the sisters poured with precision, neither indulging in idle chatter nor tolerating drunken scuffles. Most patrons respected the boundaries, though one newspaper clipping from the Las Cruces Sentinel in 1877 refers cryptically to women of firm hand whose countenance admits no mirth. At first, the saloon's reputation was simply one of sobriety, rare in such settlements. But within 2 years, fragments of stories began to circulate. Miners disappeared, sometimes in transit between camps, sometimes last seen stepping through the Rowan doorway. A clerk from the territorial court, Jebediah Carter, noted in his ledger, "Men bound for Silver City tarried there, but their names were never again spoken in our books." It was here the story began to fracture into rumor and testimony. Some said the sisters barred windows at odd hours. Others claimed to hear faint thuds beneath the floorboards, as if heavy trunks were being dragged across dirt. No marshal lodged an official complaint, but stray notations survive, scribbled in margins, unsigned, that hint the site had become a place of fear. By 1878, the Rowan Saloon's guest ledger showed gaps, names struck out, initials with no departure marks. Townsfolk grew uneasy. Reverend Thomas Kearns, in a letter preserved at the county archive, remarked, "They carried themselves with propriety, yet behind their eyes was a cold industry, as though each customer were a tally rather than a soul." And so began the unsettling case of the Saloon Sisters of New Mexico, a tale reconstructed through scraps, sworn statements, and fragments of memory, never fully resolved, but never forgotten. The Rowan sisters' history before 1876 remains clouded, preserved only in fragments of church registers and scattered affidavits. One baptismal record from Missouri mentions a Margaret and Eliza Rowan, daughters of a tinsmith who died during a cholera outbreak. A probate ledger suggests they inherited little more than a trunk of tools and a handful of silver spoons. By 1874, both appear in a census note from southern Texas, traveling with a caravan of merchants. 2 years later, they surfaced in New Mexico, leasing the very plot where the Copper Queen Saloon still stood until the 20th century. The structure itself, according to builders' notes, had been erected hastily to service mule drivers and prospectors. But it was the sisters' stern discipline and uncanny presence that gave it notoriety. Witnesses said they kept meticulous records, pages of names, sums owed, dates of entry. Yet many of those ledgers have vanished, and the few surviving scraps are half-charred or water-stained, discovered decades later in a county courthouse attic. A letter written in 1876 by Deputy Marshal Henry Talbot describes his first impression. Two women, near alike as mirrored glass, stood as if carved in stone behind the counter. No laughter, no warmth, only that unblinking gaze. The sisters rarely joined the customers' revelry. They poured, collected, and withdrew. At closing, it was said they bolted the doors with more ceremony than the law required. Locals whispered that the sisters never permitted anyone into the cellar, not even when barrels of liquor had to be stored. One drifter, whose testimony appeared later in a small trial transcript, remarked that he once heard muffled voices below, while the upstairs room was nearly empty. The context of the era sharpens the unease. Across the border in Bisbee, Arizona, mines were swelling with workers and fortunes were being made. But crime rates surged as well. Murders, disappearances, and secret burials were not uncommon. Against this backdrop, the Rowan Saloon did not at first seem remarkable. Yet, as more men failed to return from their journeys, suspicion gravitated toward its doors. By early 1877, a pattern emerged in regional newspapers. Notices for missing men, prospectors, mule drivers, gamblers, often included the line, "Last seen at a tavern kept by sisters." Some townsfolk defended them. "They ran a clean house," wrote a patron named Amos Riley. "No worse than any other saloon." But others, like Reverend Kearns, insisted the women inspired a quiet dread, one that could not be shaken. One particularly strange entry survives in a surveyor's diary, dated August 1877. "Came through Copper Queen. Saw sisters in doorway, as ever unsmiling. Strange odor in air. Could not place it, as though soil had been turned and left to bake. It was this impression, the sense of disturbed earth, that would later prove significant. For now, it remained a note in a private journal, one detail among many that built a picture of order on the surface and unease beneath. As the year wore on, stories grew darker. Ranch hands spoke of arguments at night, voices not belonging to the sisters, followed by sudden silence. Others claimed to see lamplight glowing under floorboards, though the rooms above were dark. All accounts remain circumstantial, but together they suggest a house of secrets slowly unraveling. The first disappearance formally linked to the Rowan Saloon occurred in late autumn of 1877. The man was identified in county records as Elias Boone, a mule driver on the Santa Fe Trail. He had stopped in the settlement to water his animals and was last recorded by a freight clerk as intending to take a rest at the sister's place. Boone never reappeared. His wagon was later found abandoned, harness cut, but no trace of the driver remained. The disappearance was troubling, but not extraordinary for the frontier, where ambushes and desertion were common. Yet a few months later, another case followed. A gambler named Patrick Sloan, whose name was scribbled in the Copper Queen's ledger, dated February 1878. His entry showed no departure. Witnesses later testified he had been seen drinking quietly near the bar, but no one recalled him leaving. These two incidents drew only passing notice until a third case made the pattern harder to ignore. In April, a surveyor named Matthew Clay vanished, leaving behind his tools neatly stacked by the saloon's porch. A neighbor swore that he had been invited inside by the sisters and was never seen again. When the man's brother arrived weeks later, searching for answers, he found only silence and a terse dismissal. Constable William Pratt filed the first official complaint that spring, noting, "This establishment, though reputable to sight, has been named now in 3 vanishings. Proprietors uncooperative, remarks given short, and ledger incomplete." His report, though brief, was later cited by investigators decades afterward. The sisters themselves offered little explanation. They denied ever seeing Boone, insisted Sloan had left on his own accord, and claimed Clay was a drunkard who must have wandered into the desert. Their calm, unwavering responses unnerved many. "They neither flinched nor faltered," Constable Pratt later told AM Magistrate, as if truth and falsehood weighed the same in their mouths. Meanwhile, rumors spread through the mining camps. Some claimed that men heard banging from beneath the floorboards, Others spoke of wagon loads of earth being dumped behind the property late at night. A blacksmith named Horace Bell swore in testimony years later that he saw them dragging something heavy and wrapped through the side door when the moon was low. The Copper Queen nevertheless remained open. Miners and drifters still came for whiskey, some out of necessity, others drawn by morbid curiosity. A few even recorded in their journals that they felt safer there than in rival establishments, pointing to the sisters' stern order as proof that fights were rare. But beneath the quiet discipline, unease deepened. By mid-1878, the whispers reached as far as Las Cruces and even to Bisbee, Arizona. In Bisbee, newspaper editorials about lawlessness in mining towns cited the Copper Queen as an example of a place where men enter but do not exit with their accounts balanced. Though phrased metaphorically, the remark hinted at the growing suspicion. The Rowan sisters' calm persistence in the face of these accusations made the case more chilling. Witnesses later described their expressions as stone still, as if each word had been rehearsed. And yet no lawman could prove wrongdoing. The disappearances remained unsolved, inked only in ledgers and fading testimony, while the saloon itself carried on under the desert sun. By the summer of 1878, the mood in the settlement had shifted from unease to quiet fear. Men still entered the Copper Queen saloon, but often only in pairs, rarely alone. Some refused outright, traveling farther for whiskey rather than face the sisters' unblinking stares. The local constable, William Pratt, sensing the disquiet, petitioned the county marshal for assistance. His request produced a visit from Deputy Marshal Isaac Merritt, a former soldier known for his methodical nature. Merritt's journal survives in fragments, preserved in an archive box labeled simply Territorial Law Reports. One entry, dated August 3, 1878, reads, "Inspected premises of the Rowan sisters. Exterior neat, interior well-ordered. No overt evidence of foul play, yet atmosphere chill and unnatural. Patrons speak cautiously, proprietors evasive." It was Merritt who first examined the grounds behind the saloon. Accounts differ on whether he dug himself or merely noted disturbances, but several witnesses recalled him circling the property at dusk, lantern in hand. A neighbor, Mrs. Clara Wells, later testified. The marshal stooped often, ran his hand across the soil as though searching for seams. He asked if the sisters had been seen hauling earth. I told him yes, once, late at night, with a wheelbarrow. Yet no bodies or evidence were uncovered at that time. The sisters explained the earth moving as preparation for a root cellar, a claim difficult to disprove. Still, Merritt remained unsettled. His notes mention a peculiar scent in the back room, metallic, like iron turned in damp. He advised Constable Pratt to keep watch. Meanwhile, disappearances continued. In October, a ranch hand named Daniel McCrae vanished after boasting of his winnings at cards. A fellow gambler swore McCrae had entered the Copper Queen late that night. His horse was found days later, tethered in scrubland, 2 miles to. In the early months of 1879, a storm swept across the territory, leaving roads washed out and earth shifted in strange ways. Afterward, townsfolk noticed parts of the saloon's yard had sagged slightly, as though the ground beneath had hollowed. A mule stumbled in the rut and exposed what appeared to be freshly turned soil. Constable Pratt ordered a closer look. What was uncovered was not a body, but fragments. A rusted buckle, scraps of cloth, and a boot heel detached from its leather. Though inconclusive, these objects bore signs of wear not matching the sisters' belongings. A miner named Edwin Pollard swore in a later affidavit that he recognized the boot style as belonging to the missing gambler, Patrick Sloan. No formal charges followed, but the discovery deepened suspicions. The sisters offered their usual calm explanation. According to their statement, the soil had been disturbed when a trench was dug to redirect water from the saloon's foundation. As for the boot, they claimed it must have been left behind by some former tenant of the land. Their answers, as always, were measured, but they satisfied almost no one. Deputy Marshal Merritt returned again, compelled by these findings. In his journal he noted, No skeleton unearthed, but ground loose, uneven, unnatural. Sisters maintain composure beyond reason. I suspect concealment of grave goods. His request to search the cellar was denied by territorial judges who required more substantial proof. More unease came from the patrons themselves. Several accounts describe an odor drifting up from the cellar hatch during humid nights. Like iron and mildew, wrote one rancher, with a sweetness that turned the stomach. Others described hearing a scraping sound when the saloon was nearly empty, as if something heavy dragged across earth. Despite these reports, the Copper Queen remained in business. The sisters even added improvements: new lamps, polished mirrors behind the bar, and curtains to soften the light. Such touches made the establishment seem more civilized, but for many, the veneer only sharpened the underlying dread. It was like dressing a coffin in fine cloth, remarked Reverend Kearns in a letter to a fellow minister. The folklore spread further. Men told stories of a black dog lingering near the saloon, watching silently from the road. Others whispered of a black cat glimpsed atop the roof, vanishing whenever approached. These details appear in multiple journals, though whether they were genuine sightings or embellishments is uncertain. What matters is how they colored the reputation of the place, an image of watchful creatures circling a house of secrets. In March of that year, another disappearance forced the issue back into court records. A traveling merchant, Tobias Green, was reported missing after last being seen unloading goods at the Copper Queen. His wagon was discovered miles away, its inventory largely intact. Among the items in the saloon's storeroom, investigators claimed to recognize several crates with Green's markings, though the sisters insisted they had been purchased lawfully. Deputy Merritt pressed harder, interrogating them in the presence of witnesses. Again, Margaret Rowan's reply was chillingly calm. Men come and men go. We do not answer for their steps once they leave our door. Still, with no conclusive evidence, the case stalled. What remained were fragments, boots, crates, and whispers. But in the collective memory of the town, those fragments began to resemble a grim ledger, tallying vanishings against the silent, watchful presence of the Rowan sisters. By mid-1879, contradictions in the record began to surface. Court clerks discovered that certain missing men had their names written in the Copper Queen's guest book, yet the same names were later struck through with ink so thick the paper nearly tore. In some cases, initials had been replaced with entirely different lettering, as if someone tried to obscure the trail. Constable Pratt brought this to Deputy Marshal Merritt, who noted in his papers, "Ledgers altered with intent. Sisters deny tampering. Handwriting difficult to compare, but inconsistencies plain." Still, without witnesses to the act itself, no charge could be made. The ledger fragments that survive today, kept in county storage, show exactly this: uneven, blotted pages, with gaps where names might once have been. Testimony from townsfolk grew increasingly divided. Some swore the sisters were guilty, pointing to the vanishing men and altered records. Others defended them, claiming that travelers often lied about their names or moved on without notice. "The frontier swallows men whole," one rancher said. "You can't blame every loss on the women pouring drinks." Still, the atmosphere around the Copper Queen thickened with suspicion. In July 1879, a young clerk named Samuel Avery described in a letter to his brother, "I entered for a drink, but left quickly, for the air was foul, and the sisters watched me as though I'd taken something not mine. The room was near empty, yet I felt pressed upon by unseen company." His letter, preserved in a private collection, is one of the most direct personal accounts of unease within those walls. The contradictions extended beyond the saloon. Witnesses who testified about seeing men go inside often changed their statements under oath. One miner, Henry Lowe, first swore he had watched Patrick Sloane enter, but later recanted, claiming he might have been mistaken. Whether this was due to fear, bribery, or simple uncertainty, no one could prove. Meanwhile, Deputy Merritt returned to the cellar matter. He requested a formal warrant to search the underground space. His superior in Santa Fe responded with reluctance, noting that territorial resources are strained and evidence thin. No warrant was issued. Merritt's frustration shows in his writing. I am bound by law, yet law is bound by absence of proof. The cellar remains closed, the truth beneath sealed. Despite these setbacks, folklore pressed on. Locals began telling tales of hearing voices under the saloon floor at night, low, muffled, like prayers or chants. Others swore the sisters could be seen outside at hours when the saloon was closed, moving objects in the yard under cover of lantern light. None of this entered official reports, but the stories passed from mouth to mouth, strengthening the place's dark reputation. By late 1879, the town's patience was worn thin. Pressure mounted for something to be done. Merchants began avoiding the Copper Queen, taking their business elsewhere. Yet the sisters never flinched. They continued their routine, pouring drinks, balancing books, staring down any who lingered too long. As for the disappearances, they accumulated like shadow entries in an unofficial ledger, each name adding weight to suspicions that could never be fully proven. Even Merritt, in his final report of that year, admitted, "I feel truth close at hand, yet as elusive as dust in the wind." The winter of 1879 brought a chill that settled heavy across the settlement, and with it came the discovery that would forever brand the Copper Queen in the region's memory. A violent storm cracked a portion of the saloon's foundation, loosening stones near the back stairwell. When a board gave way, revealing a shallow cavity beneath, a boy chasing a stray chicken was the first to notice. What he found inside forced the law to act. According to Pratt's later affidavit, the cavity contained remnants that could not be ignored. Bones, scattered and broken, mixed with soil and ash. Not complete skeletons, more fragments, as though interred hastily or disturbed later. A few pieces of clothing clung to the remains, including a strip of wool with stitching that matched a style known in nearby Bisbee. A belt buckle bearing the initials MC was also recovered, which many believe belonged to the missing surveyor, Matthew Clay. The discovery brought Merritt back to the saloon within days. His journal for January 4, 1880 is terse. Bones beneath foundation. Sisters deny knowledge. Faces calm, eyes without tremor. They say scavengers may have dragged remains, yet cavity sealed by stone. Explanation insufficient. The sisters allowed the excavation only after townsmen gathered in force, demanding answers. Several witnesses described the scene, lanterns casting harsh light, dirt shoveled aside, townsfolk pressing forward in silence. One recalled, "The sisters stood like statues, hands folded, as if the ground revealed nothing more than misplaced tools." No complete body was recovered, but the fragments, fingers, ribs, a jawbone, were enough to ignite outrage. Reverend Kearns proclaimed in a sermon that the Lord's judgment rests heavy on this house, and many townsfolk refused to enter again. Yet, astonishingly, the sisters were not arrested. Territorial law required firmer identification of the remains, and without complete skeletons or witnesses to a killing, the case stalled. Merritt wrote bitterly, "Law tied my hands, bones enough to chill the soul, yet not enough to convict." The folklore surrounding the Copper Queen deepened. Some whispered that the bones had been placed deliberately, as if to taunt investigators. Others claimed the sisters were part of a broader ring of smugglers, disposing of those who interfered. Still others believed the bones belonged to long-dead travelers, buried before the saloon's construction, though this explanation rang hollow to most. In the months that followed, the Copper Queen's business dwindled. Patrons avoided the bar, and supply wagons stopped calling. Yet the sisters endured, maintaining their rigid routine as though nothing had changed. "They poured whiskey with the same cold hands," wrote one newspaperman, while whispers swirled like dust at their feet. The discovery beneath the saloon shifted the story irrevocably. It was no longer rumor or coincidence. It was physical evidence, incomplete yet undeniable. But the failure to act decisively left a mark not only on the Rowan sisters' reputation, but also on the credibility of territorial law itself. And so the Copper Queen stood, a saloon half empty, its cellar now whispered of as a grave. The question that haunted every man who passed its doors was not whether something terrible had happened there, but how much of it still remained unseen, buried deeper in the earth. By the spring of 1880, the town's patience had frayed to the breaking point. With bone fragments uncovered beneath the Copper Queen and disappearances still whispered about, citizens demanded that the Rowan sisters face a tribunal. But law in that part of New Mexico was a thin net. Too many holes, too few hands to hold it. A gathering was convened in the courthouse, little more than a single room with plank benches. Witnesses offered contradictory statements. One miner swore he saw the sisters carrying a heavy bundle into the cellar. Another claimed he had never seen them touch a shovel. Reverend Kearns testified to the odor and the unnatural atmosphere, while a rancher argued the saloon had been his safest refuge from violence. The jury of townsmen, caught between fear and uncertainty, issued no indictment. Deputy Marshal Merritt, increasingly frustrated, pressed them harder than ever. In one entry he wrote, "The town bends to the sisters. Fear has made men pliant, bones enough to speak, yet no tongue dares translate them into law." Merritt's appeals to Santa Fe for reinforcements went largely unanswered. Other counties clamored for attention amid rising violence tied to the mining booms. Meanwhile, the sisters themselves grew even more enigmatic. Observers noted they dressed more formally, black garments pressed as though for mourning, their hair tied in severe knots. Their saloon, though nearly deserted, was still polished each day. "It was as though they performed for an audience that had fled," remarked one drifter, "keeping up the rituals of drink and coin, though no one came to witness." Folklore expanded to fill the gaps left by law. Some said the sisters kept ledgers not of debts, but of the dead, records of each man who vanished. Others swore that if you knocked at the saloon door after midnight, you would hear whispers answering in voices not belonging to the women. Whether believed or not, these tales spread across mining camps, adding a spectral weight to the sisters' reputation. The breaking point arrived in June, when a cattle driver named Owen Parker vanished after boasting of the wages he'd just collected. His horse was found tied near the Copper Queen. Inside the saloon, a stain marked the floorboards, quickly scrubbed but still visible to those who looked closely. Merritt seized on this, but once again the sisters insisted Parker had left alive. "He sat, he drank, and he departed," Eliza said calmly, according to Pratt's notes. "If the world swallowed him thereafter, it was no doing of ours." The townsfolk were shaken. Some demanded the sisters be run out entirely. Others warned that crossing them would only bring misfortune. In one chilling account, a blacksmith told his apprentice, "Mark me, son, the sisters are fixed like fence posts. Men may lean, men may break, but they will not move." Despite the anger, the Rowan sisters remained untouchable. Their silence, their calm replies, and the absence of definitive evidence kept them in place. The Copper Queen stood like a scar across the settlement, avoided by most, yet never abandoned. And beneath the uneasy calm, the cellar waited, its secrets buried deeper than any man dared dig. By late 1880, word of the Rowan sisters and their saloon had spread beyond the county. Newspapers in Tucson and even El Paso began running cautious stories about the House of Vanishing Men. Most were based on rumor, but the fragments of truth, bones beneath the foundation, altered ledgers, unexplained disappearances, were enough to attract the attention of officials outside the territory. Two investigators, former Pinkerton men working independently, arrived in November. Their names appear differently in surviving accounts, sometimes recorded as James Harlan and Victor Morse, other times with slight variations. But most sources agree that they came at the urging of merchants who had lost confidence in local law. Unlike Constable Pratt or Deputy Merritt, the outsiders carried both resources and experience in uncovering fraud and murder. Harlan's surviving notes, published years later in a serialized account, described his first impression of the sisters. "They received us as innkeepers, polite but cool. No fear, no surprise. Their eyes held ours without wavering, as if they measured what kind of men we were, and whether we would endure their silence." The Pinkerton men began by canvassing the region, interviewing miners, ranchers, and clerks. They gathered testimonies that, while inconsistent, painted a grim pattern. One detail recurred often. The sisters were never seen leaving the saloon together. If one stepped outside, The other always remained behind. As if, Harlan wrote, they feared leaving their house unguarded even for a breath. They also inspected the grounds by night, watching for movement. A ranch hand later testified that he saw their lanterns circling the saloon in silence, pausing often near the cellar door. Yet after weeks of observation, no smoking gun appeared. Still, the investigators pressed the case further than anyone before them, they supposed. Made supply records and discovered discrepancies. Barrels of liquor ordered for the Copper Queen outnumbered the town's population tenfold, suggesting goods were being diverted elsewhere, or to someone else. Crates marked for the saloon had been found in abandoned camps far to the south, though how they traveled there remained unexplained. The sisters, when confronted, answered with the same infuriating calm. "We serve who comes," Eliza reportedly told Harlan. "If our stock wanders farther, it is no doing of ours." The investigators concluded that smuggling was at least part of the enterprise, but whispers of murder clung stubbornly to their reports. Harlan admitted in a letter, "I cannot separate crime from commerce in this house. One feeds the other, yet neither reveals its whole face." Despite their findings, no arrests were made. The Pinkerton men left as quietly as they came, their notes scattered into archives and personal collections. To the townsfolk, their presence was little more than a ripple, proof that outsiders, too, felt the chill of the Rowan saloon, but could do no more than stare at its surface. Deputy Merritt, still on duty, wrote bitterly after their departure. "Even the famed agents leave with empty hands. The sisters remain, unbroken, as though rooted deeper than law itself." And so the Copper Queen endured, a saloon increasingly empty of customers, yet full of whispers. For those who passed its doors, it seemed the building itself had learned silence from its keepers, holding its secrets close against every probing hand. The year 1881 opened with an air of hostility. By now, the Copper Queen was less a saloon than a landmark of dread. Few entered willingly, and those who did rarely stayed long. Yet the Rowan sisters kept their routine, dusting the bar each morning, polishing glasses, striking their piano keys to test the sound, even if no one came to listen. It was in March that the first act of outright violence touched the place. A group of ranch hands, emboldened by whiskey from another tavern, stormed the Copper Queen demanding answers. Witnesses later recalled their shouts. "Where are the men you've buried? Show us the cellar!" Margaret Rowan, tall and severe, stood behind the bar without moving. Eliza, quieter but equally composed, locked the door from within. Accounts vary on what happened next. Some say the men overturned tables and broke bottles, threatening to tear up the floorboards themselves. Others insist they merely shouted until their courage failed beneath the sisters' cold stares. What is certain is that one ranch hand, Thomas Daly, ended up shot in the shoulder. Whether by accident or design remains disputed. Some claimed Eliza fired in defense, while others swore one of Daly's own companions discharged the weapon in confusion. Deputy Merritt arrived to find chaos. The wounded man survived, but the incident deepened the divide in town. For some, it proved the sisters were dangerous. For others, it confirmed they were simply defending themselves against harassment. Merritt's report concluded blandly, "No cause sufficient for arrest. Disturbance caused by intoxicated parties." Yet, in his private notes, he added, "Saloon, not safe ground. Violence, inevitable, should it remain open." The aftermath was telling. The sisters had the broken glass swept, the piano reset, and by evening the saloon looked untouched. When asked about the shooting, Margaret replied only, "Aho, use defends itself." Those words lingered, repeated often by townsfolk, as though the saloon itself were complicit. Meanwhile, rumors spread beyond the settlement. In Bisbee and Tucson, miners told tales of the Rowan sisters with grim fascination. Some embellished the stories, claiming travelers were found drained of blood or bound beneath floorboards, claims unsupported by any record, yet repeated until they blurred with fact. The name Copper Queen became synonymous with menace, even among those who had never seen its walls. The violence also emboldened the more superstitious. Men whispered that the sisters could not be harmed, that bullets would pass through them, that their calm faces were masks concealing something not human. Reverend Kearns, though skeptical of such tales, wrote, "The people speak of them in hushed tones, as one might of storms or plague." Despite all this, the sisters remained. Their composure never cracked, their routines never faltered. In the official eye of the law, they were still business owners, never convicted of a crime, but in the eye of the town, they had become something else entirely, figures fixed at the center of a shadowed story, unyielding and inscrutable. The Copper Queen stood, scarred now by gunfire and broken bottles, yet more infamous than ever. To passers-by on the lonely road, its sign was no longer an invitation, but a warning. And for Deputy Merritt, who watched from the margins, the sense was growing that the next chapter in this case would not end without blood spilled openly in the dust. By the summer of 1881, the demand to close the Copper Queen had grown too loud to ignore. Merchants argued it was bad for trade, mothers warned their sons to avoid it, and even passing travelers had heard the stories. In July, the county magistrate finally ordered a hearing to determine whether the saloon should be shut down as a public nuisance. The hearing was held in the courthouse, a sweltering wooden room where townsfolk crowded shoulder to shoulder. Witnesses spoke in turn. Some described the vanishings, others the bones found beneath the floor. Yet under questioning, most accounts collapsed into rumor. One miner admitted, "I never saw a killing myself, only heard the talk." Another confessed he had no evidence, only unease. When it was the sisters' turn to answer, they arrived dressed in somber black, their hands folded, their posture rigid. Margaret spoke for them both, her voice measured and low. "We are keepers of a house of trade," she said. "If men wander from our doors and do not return, the desert is wide, the road long, and misfortune common." The words, though plain, carried the same chilling steadiness that had unsettled every investigator before. Deputy Marshal Merritt testified as well. He described the altered ledgers, the bones, and the odor beneath the cellar. Yet, when pressed by the magistrate, he admitted that he could not prove murder, nor link the remains definitively to the missing men. His frustration showed in the record. All signs point to the house, yet the house reveals nothing. The magistrate, bound by law, declared there was insufficient evidence to close the establishment. The ruling struck many as a betrayal. Some shouted in anger, others left the courthouse in silence. The sisters, unmoved, returned to their saloon that evening and lit their lamps as though nothing had happened. In the weeks that followed, business dwindled, even further. The Copper Queen became a hollow shell, frequented only by the most desperate drifters. But rather than weaken the sisters' hold, the emptiness seemed to intensify it. One rancher remarked, "They tend their saloon like a grave, sweeping, polishing, waiting, as though each chair belonged to a ghost." Folklore grew bolder in the absence of resolution. Tales spread of voices calling from the cellar, of shadowed figures seen through upstairs windows long after the lamps were out. A black dog was said to prowl the road, its eyes reflecting lantern light, though no flame was near. Some swore a black cat, perched upon the Copper Queen sign itself, vanishing whenever approached. These stories blurred the line between testimony and superstition. Yet in the minds of many, they carried more weight than the failed hearing. The Rowan sisters were no longer simply innkeepers. They were fixtures in a legend the law could not contain. By the close of 1881, the settlement was divided. Some demanded another attempt to shut the place down. Others avoided it entirely, content to let the sisters linger like shadows at the edge of the road. But all agreed on one point. The Copper Queen was no longer a saloon. It had become a symbol, a scar of unease etched into the heart of New Mexico's frontier. The following spring of 1882 brought a discovery that revived every fear the hearing had failed to resolve. Heavy rains flooded the settlement, washing out part of the road that curved near the Copper Queen. When the water subsided, townsfolk found that the ground behind the saloon had slumped away, exposing what looked like the corner of a crude wooden box. Constable Pratt and Deputy Merritt were called immediately. With several witnesses present, they pried open the box. Inside were human remains, this time not fragments, but an almost complete skeleton. Though the skull was cracked and the bones weathered, scraps of fabric and a tarnished pocket watch suggested an identity. Owen Parker, the cattle driver who had vanished a year earlier. The initials, O.P., were scratched inside the watch cover, leaving little doubt. The discovery should have sealed the case, yet once again the law faltered. The sisters denied any knowledge of the box or its contents. Margaret claimed it must have washed down from an old trail burial, while Eliza stated flatly, "We bury no one." The explanation rang hollow, but without evidence tying them directly to the act, conviction remained elusive. The townsfolk, however, were less forgiving. The news spread quickly, carried by travelers to Bisbee and El Paso, where editors ran lurid headlines about the Sisters of the Copper Queen. Some papers described them as poisoners, others as thieves who murdered for profit. None of the articles carried proof, but the impression hardened. This was no longer rumor, but infamy. Merritt pressed harder than ever, demanding to search the cellar. Again, legal delays stalled him. His journal entry from May 1882 is among the most haunting. "I stood at the hatch with warrant unsigned, and the sisters watching. Their eyes held no fear. Behind them, the floor creaked as though remembering." Witness testimony grew more vivid as the case reignited. A miner claimed to hear hammering under the floor at midnight. A neighbor swore she saw the sisters unloading a wagon covered in tarpaulin, though the contents remained hidden. Still, none of this transformed into actionable evidence. Meanwhile, the folklore became inseparable from the facts. Men spoke of the black dog again, lingering near the washout as if guarding the uncovered box. Others swore a cat was seen on the saloon roof that night, eyes glinting with an unnatural light. Whether hallucination, fear, or invention, these details spread quickly, embroidered into the growing legend. The townsfolk gathered once more to demand the Copper Queen's closure. But by now fear held equal weight with anger. Few dared confront the sisters directly, believing some curse would follow. Instead, they whispered and waited, hoping the law would finish what gossip could not. The sisters themselves remained unchanged. They cleaned the saloon, reset the chairs, and opened each evening as though no grave had been revealed behind their walls. To those who passed by, their silhouettes in the lamplight seemed more like sentinels than innkeepers, two figures holding vigil over secrets too deeply buried to ever be brought into the sun. After the grim discovery of Owen Parker's remains, several townsmen resolved to watch the sisters more closely. They did not trust the law to act, and so they formed a quiet pact, rotating night watches along the road, hoping to catch sight of whatever might happen when the Copper Queen's doors closed. One such watchman, a young clerk named Daniel Fry, kept a small notebook. His entries, later found in his belongings, describe nights of silence punctuated by unsettling glimpses. On one occasion, he claimed to see Margaret carrying a lantern into the yard at nearly 3 a.m, pausing often to scan the darkness. Eliza, he wrote, followed minutes later with what appeared to be a bundle wrapped in cloth. The two disappeared behind the saloon, and when they returned, the bundle was gone. Other observers reported different details, faint hammering sounds from beneath the floorboards, or a metallic scrape echoing in the still air. Some swore they heard muffled voices even when no one had entered. Yet whenever Constable Pratt attempted to verify these accounts, nothing could be proven. The sisters opened their doors each morning to reveal only neat tables, swept floors, and their unwavering calm. Deputy Merritt, weary but persistent, joined the watches himself. His journal for October 1882 notes, "Observe sisters at odd hours, never together. One inside, one outside, always. Their vigilance unnatural. If commerce were their only concern, such patterns unneeded." The growing unease led some to speculate that the sisters guarded not merely their property, but something hidden within it, perhaps a chamber deeper than the known cellar. These suspicions gained weight when a traveler, lost in drink, swore he stumbled upon a locked trap-door in the back room. His claim was dismissed as drunken invention, but the story spread quickly. Folklore magnified every report. The black dog was said to accompany Margaret during her nocturnal rounds, walking the edge of lantern light before vanishing. The black cat, likewise, was said to appear above the Copper Queen sign whenever Eliza emerged. To the watchers, these details lent an eerie rhythm to the sisters' movements, as if animals themselves had joined in their vigil. One chilling incident hardened the town's suspicions. A prospector named Levi Burns, who had openly spoken against the sisters, claimed he was followed one night after leaving the Copper Queen. In his testimony, he described hearing footsteps that matched his pace, though no figure could be seen. When he turned a corner, he spotted Eliza standing still under a lamppost, hands folded. She said nothing, offered no greeting, only watched as he hurried away. Burns left town within days and never returned. Despite these accounts, no decisive action came. The magistrate in Santa Fe demanded physical evidence, not rumors and sightings. Merritt's frustration boiled over in his final report of that year. The sisters hold the town by silence. Their actions are seen, yet proof is air. Men vanish, bones emerge, but still the law hesitates. I fear it will not be the law that ends this. The Copper Queen endured, its door still opening each dusk, its lamp still burning through the night. But by now, most agreed the saloon was no longer a place of drink and trade. It had become a stage where the sisters enacted their silent rituals, and the town itself sat as unwilling audience, waiting for the curtain to fall. In the spring of 1883, fate itself forced a glimpse into the Copper Queen's secrets. A lantern overturned during a dust storm, setting fire to a storage shed attached to the saloon. Flames licked at the side wall before townsfolk managed to contain them with buckets of sand and water. The sisters stood outside during the effort, silent as ever, watching the crowd fight to save their property, without lifting a hand themselves. When the blaze was finally subdued, attention turned to what the fire had exposed. The shed's rear wall had collapsed, revealing a narrow passage that no one had known existed. According to Constable Pratt's report, the passage led into a small chamber, dug directly into the earth, lined with crude shelving. On those shelves rested objects of unsettling variety, boots, belts, and tattered coats, some bearing initials scratched into the leather. A few were recognized immediately as belonging to men long missing from the territory. The sisters offered a swift explanation. Margaret claimed the goods were left behind by drifters unable to pay their tabs. Eliza added, in her flat tone, "The desert has no use for possessions, but a house may keep what is owed." Their reasoning, though chillingly practical, did little to calm the crowd that had gathered. Deputy Merritt seized upon the discovery, arguing that these items tied the sisters directly to the missing men. But when the case reached the magistrate once more, the argument faltered. None of the possessions could be proven beyond doubt, and the sisters insisted that travelers often sold or pawned belongings for drink. As before, suspicion hardened, but law remained inert. Folklore grew richer with the fire's aftermath. People began calling the hidden space the Chamber of Debts, claiming it was where the sisters stored not only goods but the memories of those they had claimed. Some whispered that, but the room smelled faintly of smoke even after it was emptied, as though the fire had marked it permanently. Others said they heard scratching from within when the shed was rebuilt, as though something remained behind. One curious note survives from the Reverend Kearns, written in his journal a week after the fire. "I looked upon the chamber and felt as though the air itself recoiled. The sisters' calm speech carried the weight of practiced lies, yet no tremor betrayed them. I fear they believe in their right to keep what men leave, be it coin, cloth, or life itself." Despite the discovery, the Copper Queen reopened within days. The sisters swept the ashes, rebuilt the shed, and resumed their routine with mechanical precision. Townsfolk, however, grew wary of passing too near. Travelers avoided the road entirely when possible, diverting miles out of their way. Merritt, by now graying and weary, noted bitterly, "Fire revealed what law could not. Yet still they stand, unbroken. If judgment comes, it will not be written by magistrates, but carved in the silence of this land." The legend of the Copper Queen had grown darker, the fire adding fuel to its story. And yet the sisters, unchanged in their demeanor, seemed only more resolute, as though the flames themselves had tested their resolve and found it unshaken. In the autumn of 1883, the story of the Rowan sisters took its most unsettling turn. Without warning, they were gone. No notice, no farewell, no sale of property. Simply absence. The Copper Queen's lamps, once faithfully lit each dusk, remained dark. For several nights townsfolk waited, assuming illness or a journey. But as weeks passed, it became clear. The sisters had vanished. Deputy Merritt, who had pursued them for years, entered the saloon himself with Pratt and a handful of townsmen. What they found was both ordinary and uncanny. The bar stood as if prepared for service, glasses polished, bottles aligned. The piano keys were dusted, the curtains drawn neat. On the counter lay 2 ledgers, one open to a blank page, the other filled with names struck through so heavily that the paper tore. More disturbing was the upstairs room. 2 narrow beds had been made tightly, as though awaiting inspection. On one, folded precisely, lay a black dress and gloves. On the other, a single rosary. There was no sign of struggle, no packed trunks, no trail of departure. Outside, the dog that had often lingered on the road was seen pacing for days, then vanished as suddenly as its mistresses. The cellar, when finally pried open, offered its own quiet terror. Townsmen described uneven earth, freshly disturbed in patches, but no bodies were uncovered. A few broken bottles, scraps of fabric, and the scent of iron lingered in the damp air. Whether it had been emptied deliberately or held nothing more will never be known. The disappearance baffled every attempt at explanation. Some believed the sisters fled under assumed names, joining distant relatives or vanishing into Mexico. Others swore they had been aided by sympathizers who valued silence over justice. Folklore, of course, offered darker theories, that the sisters had been claimed by whatever secret they served, swallowed back Ios, and to the earth like their victims. The saloon itself became a relic, abandoned, its windows broken by storms, its sign faded and tilting. Travelers reported hearing piano notes within long after the building fell into disuse. A ranch hand in 1885 wrote in his journal, "I passed the Copper Queen at dusk. No roof, no light. Yet I swear I saw 2 women standing at the counter, still as ever, as if waiting for me to sit." County officials eventually ordered the structure torn down, but it resisted dismantling. Several workers refused to touch it, claiming unease. Those who did said the timbers were strangely heavy, as though saturated with something unseen. When the last wall fell, the ground beneath was left uneven, patches of soil sinking slowly with each rain. The Rowan sisters themselves were never found. No confirmed sighting, no document, no grave. Merritt, in his final years, wrote, "The house has ended, but the women remain in its shadow. They endure wherever silence is stronger than law." His words, scrawled in a fading hand, became one of the last direct records of the case. By the close of the decade, the Copper Queen was already legend, a caution whispered to travelers, a story retold in mining camps, a memory carried on in county records too fragile to yield certainty. The sisters' fate was unknown, and perhaps that was the cruelest legacy of all. Decades after the disappearance of the Rowan sisters, the case of the Copper Queen resurfaced not in courtrooms, but in libraries and lecture halls. By the early 20th century, professors and amateur historians began piecing together the fragments, newspaper clippings, affidavits, Merritt's journals, and scattered testimonies. What they uncovered was less a solved mystery than a tapestry of contradictions. At the University of New Mexico, one professor of history, Dr. Walter Langley, presented a paper in 1912 titled "The Vanishings at the Copper Queen." He argued that the sisters were likely smugglers who used their saloon as a cover, and that the disappearances were tied to disputes over stolen goods. Yet he admitted in his notes that the bones beneath the saloon complicated this view. "Commerce explains some," he wrote, "but not the silence of the cellar." Writers in Bisbee and El Paso revisited the case as well, often blurring fact with folklore. A serialized article in the Bisbee Daily Review described the sisters as poisoners, citing supposed recipes for bitter draughts found in their ledgers. No such recipes exist in surviving fragments, but the idea took hold, coloring popular memory. By the 1920s, the Rowan sisters had entered the realm of cautionary tales, invoked whenever someone disappeared along lonely roads. Even official archivists struggled. County records, already fragile, suffered from fires in 1907 and 1915 that destroyed many original affidavits. What remained were partial transcripts, handwritten copies, and testimonies riddled with inconsistencies. In one surviving letter, a clerk confessed, "The sisters haunt us more in the gaps than in the words." Scholars also drew connections to events beyond New Mexico. In reviewing records from Bisbee, Arizona, where the mining booms brought violence and lawlessness, they found similar cases of vanishings near-Jez, or isolated saloons. Some suggested the Rowan sisters were not unique, but part of a broader pattern of frontier violence that left more questions than answers. Still, the Copper Queen stood out for its endurance, a saloon kept immaculate by two women who outlasted law, rumor, and even open violence, until vanishing on their own terms. The folklore, however, never faded. Travelers into the 20th century still claim to feel unease near the site where the Copper Queen once stood. Some spoke of piano notes drifting faintly on the wind. Others swore to see the shape of two women in black at the roadside. A WPA oral history project in the 1930s recorded one elderly rancher saying, "We never dug deep enough. They're still there, just watching, waiting." By this point, the Rowan sisters had become more myth than flesh, symbols of the unsettled West, figures who blurred the boundary between documented crime and whispered legend. Historians might debate the facts, but locals carried the memory in stories, told late at night by firelight, with more shiver than certainty. The Copper Queen, though long vanished in timber and glass, lived on in this way, as a shadow stitched into the very memory of New Mexico, a reminder that some houses keep their secrets even after the walls fall. By the mid-20th century, the site where the Copper Queen once stood had become little more than uneven ground. The desert reclaimed what remained, scattering scrub and dust over the foundation. Yet the absence itself drew attention. Locals warned travelers not to camp near the spot, claiming the earth there doesn't rest. In the 1950s, a team of amateur historians from Albuquerque visited the site with shovels and notebooks. They found only fragments, rusted nails, a broken glass stopper, and what might have been part of a buckle. Still, one researcher recorded an unsettling detail in his diary. "The soil gave way under my boot, as though hollow beneath. We dared not dig further." Hikers who passed along the road into the 1970s often told stories of unease. Some spoke of hearing piano notes carried faintly on the wind, though the nearest town was miles away. Others swore to see two figures at twilight, standing where the saloon door would have been. When approached, the shapes dissolved into shadow. Even in recent decades, folklorists gathering oral histories found the story alive. An elderly woman in Las Cruces recalled how her grandfather would refuse to pass the site after dusk. "He said the sisters were still counting men in their ledger," she explained. "If you walked too close, they'd mark your name down too." Modern researchers tried to frame these stories in rational terms: psychological suggestion, the power of local legend, the eerie atmosphere of abandoned ground. Yet the persistence of the tales hinted at something more enduring. The Rowan sisters had not merely vanished, they had become woven into the fabric of the place itself. Even the name survived. Maps of the region still mark a bend in the road as Copper Queen Crossing, though no building remains to justify it. Travelers who pause there often describe an inexplicable chill, a silence deeper too, on the desert's norm. One writer in the 1990s noted, "It felt as though the land itself remembered, holding on to a secret it will not share." Thus the Copper Queen endures in echoes, not as a standing structure, not as a proven crime scene, but as a place where memory refuses to fade. Scholars return, hikers pause, locals whisper. The sister story remains unresolved, half-buried, like the bones once found beneath their saloon, and perhaps that is why it persists. The Rowan sisters never faced trial, never confessed, never explained. Their names drift through ledgers, affidavits, and folklore, always calm, always watchful. And though the saloon is gone, the legend remains, an uneasy scar on New Mexico's frontier memory, impossible to erase. Today, the Copper Queen exists only in memory and rumor, its timbers long scattered, its sign rotted into the earth. Yet in New Mexico, the story lingers like a shadow that refuses the light. Travelers still mention the bend in the road, where the wind carries a hollow sound and the soil feels soft underfoot. Some claim to sense eyes upon them, as though unseen figures watch quietly from the margins. The Rowan sisters themselves left no confirmed trace. No graves, no descendants, no definitive sightings. Their disappearance remains a gap in history, a blank space where certainty cannot be written. And in that silence, the legend took root. For some, they were cold-blooded criminals who preyed upon desperate men. For others, they became symbols of a lawless era, women who turned silence into power. Still others whisper they were never truly gone, only absorbed back into the land they guarded so fiercely. The one thread that ties all versions together is unease. In official records, in witness accounts, in folklore passed down through generations, the Rowan sisters remain unsettlingly still, calm, composed, unreadable. Even scholars, citing events in nearby Bisbee to anchor the context of the times, admit that the Copper Queen stands apart. Its story cannot be fully explained, only retold, each telling shaping it anew. Perhaps that is why the case endures, not because it offers answers, but because it denies them. A forgotten case file reconstructed from scattered scraps, always incomplete, always leaving the listener with the sense that something remains buried just out of reach. And so the story closes, not with resolution, but with echo. The Copper Queen is gone, but the silence it left behind still clings to the land. If you ever find yourself traveling those New Mexico roads at dusk, and the wind grows suddenly still, you may feel it too, the weight of names struck. Go from a ledger, the gaze of figures unseen, and the whisper that some doors are never meant to open.